A Melting Melody. By David Hall. 24.04.2025. Chapter List. 1. The Road to Crimson Hollow. 2. A Welcome Performance. 3. Twilight Tune. 4. The Melting Hour. 5. Ashes and Echoes. 6. The Last Note. 7. A New Town, a New Song. 8. The Eternal Encore. 9. Strings of Damnation. Summary: in a dark and twisted fantasy realm, a nameless bard roams from town to town, wielding a cursed guitar that channels magical melodies of death. His music is enchanting, so beautiful it kills. At each new destination, he lures the unsuspecting with promises of a free concert at sunset. When the performance begins, his true power is revealed. The haunting notes melt flesh, dissolve bone, and leave nothing behind but twisted remains and the echoes of agony. The bard survives by looting the dead, funding a luxurious and untethered lifestyle, always staying one step ahead of suspicion. As he approaches the peaceful village of Crimson Hollow, his routine is flawless, but something feels different this time. Shadows of guilt stir. Whispers of resistance rise. A presence lingers in the aftermath of the concert, a figure immune to the music, or worse, attuned to it. As the bard moves on, a question haunts the path ahead: will the music ever end, or is he doomed to play this deadly encore forever? Chapter 1, The Road to Crimson Hollow. The road stretched on, a ribbon of dust and forgotten stories winding through the hills. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the path as the bard made his way toward the village of Crimson Hollow. He had learned to savor the approach, the quiet before the storm. It was always the same. A new town, a fresh audience, a fleeting moment of peace before the inevitable chaos. The bard's steps were deliberate, measured, as he strolled through the sparse trees lining the road. His guitar, worn with age but still gleaming, hung by a leather strap across his back. It was a beautiful instrument, intricately carved, the wood dark and almost gleaming in the fading light. But it wasn't just a piece of craftsmanship, it was his tool, his weapon, and his means of survival. Crimson Hollow was like any other village. Simple. Peaceful. Naive. The kind of place that could easily be lulled into complacency by the soft, sweet strains of a stranger's music. He could already picture it, the town square filled with eager faces, waiting for the show to begin. They would be thrilled. They always were. He passed through the village gates without ceremony, unnoticed by most. The townsfolk were busy with their daily routines, unaware of the sinister presence now among them. The bard smiled to himself, pleased by the anonymity of it all. He had no intention of staying long, just a performance, a few stolen possessions, and then on to the next town. The innkeeper at the local tavern was an old hand at these kinds of things. He greeted the bard with a warm handshake and a knowing smile. "Heard you're planning a little concert for the town tonight. Sun's setting soon. A fine time for it?" The bard nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Yes, a concert. For everyone. It's been a while since I played for such a gathering." "Plenty of people already heard," the innkeeper added with a chuckle. "Town's abuzz about it. The whole square will be there." That was all the bard needed to hear. He made his way to the small stage in the town square, setting up just as the last rays of the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The shadows deepened, and the villagers began to trickle into the square, drawn by the promises of a free performance. By the time the town bell tolled for evening, the square was crowded. The air was thick with anticipation, and the bard stood, poised, guitar in hand. He adjusted the strings, tuning them carefully. A single note, soft and haunting, floated into the air. It hung there, suspended, like a question waiting to be answered. The villagers were captivated. The bard's fingers danced across the strings, the first few notes floating on the evening breeze. His eyes closed briefly as he let the music flow through him. This was the moment when everything was still and perfect, before the magic began. He could already hear the collective sigh of pleasure from the crowd as the melody wrapped itself around their minds, soft and lulling. The first wave would be easy, just a simple tune to draw them in. And so it began, the deadly performance that would change everything in Crimson Hollow. Chapter 2, A Welcome Performance. As the last streaks of twilight faded, the bard's fingers pressed harder against the strings of his guitar, each note now laden with a deeper power. The melody twisted and shifted, barely perceptible at first, like a whisper brushing against the skin of the listeners. But the effect was undeniable. Around him, the crowd stood motionless, their faces alight with rapturous expressions. The air hummed with a faint electric charge, drawing them all closer, as if the sound itself was a tether pulling them together. The bard's eyes flickered open, scanning the sea of faces before him. He saw the glimmer of wonder in their eyes, eager, trusting, and it stirred something dark inside him. He knew this look all too well. This was the moment when everything changed. From the corner of his vision, he caught the figures of a few children barefoot and laughing, squeezing between the adults, desperate for a glimpse of the stage. Their parents, too caught up in the moment, hardly noticed. The bard's lips quirked into a smile, though it was a cold, calculating one. Children were often the most easily taken, their innocence acting like an invitation to what he was about to offer. He adjusted his posture and let the melody stretch, curling around the crowd like a snake, coiling tighter with every passing second. His fingers continued to glide across the strings effortlessly, each note a smooth drop in the poison that would soon begin to take its toll. The air thickened. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth were listening. Some of the villagers began to sway slightly, mesmerized, their bodies responding involuntarily to the rhythm. Others stood frozen, entranced by the smooth, flowing patterns of sound. A soft murmur began to stir through the crowd, an uncertain whisper, a question, perhaps. The first trickles of unease, but no one dared to break the spell. It was then that the first change took place. A young woman in the front row, her eyes wide with awe, gave a small gasp. Her hand twitched at her side as if something heavy had settled into her chest. But she made no sound. Instead, she remained rooted to the spot, her expression fixed, entranced. Her fingers trembled as though the very sound of the music was vibrating through her bones. The bard's fingers danced faster now, his pace picking up as his heart beat in time with the rhythm. The magic would soon be in full force, its tendrils wrapping around the listeners, worming into their veins like a slow poison. At the edges of the crowd, a few older folk seemed to falter, their hands gripping at their throats, their faces blanching. But still, they stood silent. Still, they swayed. The bard's gaze flicked to the innkeeper standing near the edge of the square. The older man, a jovial sort, had been one of the first to greet him that afternoon. Now his face was pale, his mouth open as if to speak, but the words never came. His eyes were glassy, wide, staring at the stage. He was already lost, already gone. The music surged forward, wrapping itself around the village like an impenetrable web. Those who resisted, who felt the pull but could not yet understand it, began to sway violently, as if fighting against an invisible force. But there was no escape. The bard's music was a tide that no one could outrun. The first screams broke the air. A man at the back of the crowd clutched at his face, his hands coming away covered in slick, sticky fluid. He screamed again, high-pitched and jagged, but it was already too late. His skin began to bubble and melt beneath his fingers, sliding away like candle wax beneath the heat of an unseen flame. His scream turned into a wet, gurgling noise, but his body was already crumbling. His hair had long since fallen out, the flesh of his face dissolving into nothingness. The crowd stood, frozen, mesmerized, as the man's body slumped to the ground in a heap of slick, melted remains. The music never stopped. The bard's fingers never faltered as the first wave of death washed over the villagers. The transformation was slow at first, like the ripple of a wave breaking against a distant shore, but it soon escalated. More figures began to crumble, their faces sagging, their skin dissolving in front of their own eyes. The stench of burning flesh filled the square, but none could look away, too entranced by the sound to even attempt to flee. The bard didn't care. He never did. This was the art of it, the perfection of the execution. His music, his melody, was the only thing that mattered. He had perfected it over the years. His fingers had long ago learned the rhythm of death, and the notes fell from his guitar like 100 tiny death bells, calling those who listened to their final, fatal rest. He saw the panic beginning to break through in some faces, the horror of realizing too late what had been done to them. But even as they reached for their throats, desperate for air, the magic held them fast. The music was not merely a song, it was a bond, a tether that could not be broken until it was done. A few figures stumbled back, gasping for breath, clutching at their faces, their arms. But they were already melting. Their eyes wept tears of thick, oily liquid. Their skin hung loosely from their bodies, no longer recognizable as human. The bard's eyes gleamed as he played on. He was already thinking about the loot he would take, about the coins he would collect, the jewelry he would sell, and the homes he would enter once the town was silent. Everything belonged to him, now. The town's wealth, its future, its very life force, it was all his. The last of the screams faltered as the crowd dwindled into silence. And still, the bard played. The song ended, but the echoes of it lingered long after. Chapter 3, Twilight Tune. The last of the screams had faded into an eerie silence, leaving the village square cloaked in darkness and a thick, unnatural stillness. Only the soft rustle of the night breeze through the trees could be heard, barely perceptible over the ringing in the bard's ears. He stood motionless, his guitar still in his hands, fingers hovering above the strings. He could almost feel the lingering echo of his melody vibrating through the air, even as the world around him quieted. He let his eyes roam over the carnage before him, a twisted form of satisfaction filling him. The crowd, once full of life and joy, now lay broken, their bodies melted into puddles of viscous, grotesque remains. It was beautiful, in its own way, the symphony of death, this artful destruction. The town square, once vibrant with hope and the hum of conversation, now resembled a scene from a nightmare. Only the faintest whispers of movement were left, few bodies still struggled, their last moments a silent testament to the power of the bard's performance. The weak, the slow, the last to succumb, were now nothing more than fleeting shadows in the thickening night. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but the bard remained unbothered, his expression unchanged. He hadn't yet played his final note, there was still more to be done. The town would be his for the taking, he had plenty of time. He turned his gaze toward the buildings that lined the square, many with windows aglow. Their light no longer seemed warm. There was no one left to appreciate it. He knew that once he had gathered all that was left of their wealth, coins, jewels, and any items of value, he would disappear before dawn. He had done this 1,000 times before. The towns would never connect the dots, would never realize the true nature of the monster who passed through their midst. The bard began to step away from the stage, but before he could take more than a few steps, a faint sound reached his ears, a voice, or rather, a whisper, slicing through the thick silence. It was a soft murmur, barely perceptible at first, but there it was. The faintest hint of life amid the devastation. He paused. His gaze shifted, narrowing. Had someone survived? It was rare. But not impossible. The magic was always potent, yet sometimes there were outliers. A few individuals, for reasons he could never fully understand, managed to resist its effects. He turned toward the source of the sound, the eerie stillness pressing in on him. At the far corner of the square, a figure moved slowly, hesitantly. His pulse quickened, his eyes narrowing in on the shape of a person, a survivor. The bard could see the figure swaying slightly, as if still under the spell of the music, yet somehow moving despite the horror around them. A man. Tall, thin, with dark hair and a face that appeared unmarked by the ravages of his magic. His eyes, though, gleamed with a strange, unsettling clarity. There was something about the way he moved slow, deliberate that suggested he was not entirely overcome. The bard took a few cautious steps forward, his curiosity piqued. Could it be? Could someone have survived his music? The man's eyes flicked toward him, meeting the bard's gaze with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The bard froze for a moment, an unfamiliar sensation creeping through him. But the moment passed, and the bard's lips curled into a sly grin. It didn't matter. He would just have to play again, just a few more notes, and this one too would fall. The man's expression didn't change as he continued to approach, his movements smooth, unhurried. He seemed unaffected by the scene around him, the melted remains, the stench of burning flesh that clung to the air. In fact, it was as though the man had come from another world altogether, untouched by the horrors that had overtaken the town. The bard's fingers twitched toward his guitar. He could feel the power thrumming beneath the strings, waiting to be unleashed once again. Another melody, another wave of destruction. But then the man spoke. "You think you can escape, don't you?" His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he stepped closer. "You think you can hide forever in the shadows of your music?" The bard's smile faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "You should be dead by now. You should be melting, just like the rest of them." The man's lips twisted into a half-smile. "I know what you are. And I know what you do. I've been watching you for a long time." The bard's fingers gripped the neck of his guitar, his knuckles white. "Who are you?" he demanded, a touch of irritation creeping into his voice. "Another one of these townsfolk who thinks they can stop me." The man shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No. I'm not from this town. But I've seen your work, your kind of magic. And I'm not afraid of you." The bard took a step back, eyes narrowing. The man's words hung heavy in the air, and the bard felt a small flicker of uncertainty deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in centuries. The man continued, "You're running out of time." The bard's mind raced. He could feel it, the slow, creeping sensation that something was wrong. This wasn't part of the plan. The music had always worked, without fail. But this man, he was different. The way he looked at him, the way he stood so unafraid, it was as though he knew something the bard didn't. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, moving faster than the bard could react. Before the bard could even strum a note, the man was upon him, grabbing his wrist with an iron grip. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then the man spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You don't know what you've done. But I'm going to show you." The bard's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. Chapter 4, The Shifting Tides. The grip around the bard's wrist tightened, cold and unyielding. For the first time in years, he felt trapped. The man before him didn't seem like an ordinary survivor. He didn't fit the mold of the weak, trembling victims the bard was accustomed to. There was something about him, something unsettlingly calm and resolute, that gnawed at the edges of the bard's confidence. For a moment, the bard simply stared at the man, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The music that had been so effortlessly devastating just moments ago now seemed distant, irrelevant. The man wasn't moving like someone under the spell of the bard's power. He wasn't melting. He wasn't dying. "Let go of me," the bard muttered, his voice tight with anger, though he was careful not to show weakness. His fingers hovered dangerously close to the guitar's strings, ready to unleash another wave of death at any moment. But the man didn't budge. He held the bard's wrist firmly, unflinching, as though he had all the time in the world. "Your music, it's not enough anymore," the man said softly, his voice almost pitying. You've done enough damage. But you haven't seen what happens when the tide turns. The bard's brow furrowed, and a flash of suspicion crossed his mind. The tide turns. What do you mean by that? He jerked his arm, trying to break free from the man's grip, but it was no use. The man's hold was too strong. You haven't been paying attention, the man continued, his eyes locking with the bard's. There was a strange gleam in them, a glint of something ancient and knowing. All this time, all these towns, all these deaths, you've been making a mistake. A mistake you're about to pay for. The bard's lips twisted into a sneer. He was no fool. He had traveled through countless towns, had seen every form of resistance and defiance. There had always been someone who thought they could stand against him, but none of them ever succeeded. What made this man think he was any different? I don't know who you think you are, the bard spat, but I don't take threats lightly. I'm not threatening you, the man replied calmly. I'm warning you. Your reign of terror ends now. You don't get to just leave and keep going. The music you play, it's not as harmless as you think. It's waking things that should stay asleep. The bard's heart skipped a beat at the mention of this. He had always believed his magic was unparalleled. He knew the cost of it, the destruction it caused, but he had never considered it might awaken something more dangerous than he was. For the first time, doubt crept in. The man took a step closer, his voice low, deliberate. You're about to find out that there are forces far older and stronger than you. You've played with death, with destruction. But there are those who will come for you. And they will not stop. The bard's grip on his guitar tightened. He could feel the power surging beneath the strings, begging to be unleashed. But a lingering uncertainty held him back. Something about the man's words echoed too loudly in his mind. He had spent so long perfecting his power, his grip on life and death, that the very thought of something more powerful than him seemed impossible. You're lying, the bard growled, though the unease in his chest was undeniable. What are you, some kind of prophet? Some fool who thinks he can change what's been set in motion? The man shook his head, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You'll understand soon enough. You've made a pact with forces that are beyond your control. And now you're just another pawn in a much larger game. The bard's mind raced. He could feel the music, the magic, vibrating in his chest, telling him to strike. But this man, this survivor, was something else. The bard was no stranger to fear, but now, for the first time, he felt a true pang of it. Who was this man? What did he know that he didn't? You're not going anywhere, the man said, his grip never faltering. You're going to face the consequences of your actions. And you're going to learn what it's like to be the one who's hunted. The bard's thoughts were clouded with panic. He couldn't lose control. Not now. Not when he had everything in place. But the words of the man, the cold certainty in his voice, struck at something deep within him. Something that the bard had never truly acknowledged until now. You think you can stop me? The bard's voice trembled slightly, the first sign of genuine fear creeping into his tone. He could feel the air around him growing thick, as if the very ground beneath his feet was shifting. The man stepped back, releasing the bard's wrist with one final, lingering touch. I don't need to stop you, he said softly. I just need to remind you of something. With that, the man turned and began walking away, his movements slow and deliberate. The tide is turning, he said over his shoulder, his voice barely a whisper. And soon, you'll be the one who's caught in it. The bard stood frozen, his guitar still gripped tightly in his hands, the familiar melody bubbling up within him. But now, something felt wrong. The strings seemed to hum in a way that they never had before, and the weight of the guitar felt heavier than ever. A quiet dread settled over him, the realization that the man's words might not have been empty after all. For the first time, the bard didn't know what came next. Chapter 5, Unraveling the Strings. The man's footsteps faded into the distance, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the village. The bard stood there, motionless, his guitar hanging from his hands like an anchor, its weight pulling at him in a way it never had before. The town was still, save for the breeze that whispered through the ruins, the air thick with the scent of death and melted flesh. The bard's pulse quickened as he stood alone in the middle of the village square, uncertainty gnawing at him like a persistent hunger. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The man's words haunted him. The tide is turning. What did that mean? What could he possibly be referring to? For the first time in decades, the bard couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something beyond his control. He glanced around the square, taking in the ruined bodies, the pools of melted flesh, the remnants of his performance. His eyes caught on a few scattered possessions, coins, jewelry, trinkets, all the spoils of his latest massacre. But the satisfaction he once felt from such things was gone. The thrill of the hunt, the joy of destruction, felt distant, as if a shadow had been cast over everything he had once relished. The familiar hum of the guitar's magic pulsed under his fingers, but it was different now. He could feel the strings vibrating with an energy he didn't understand, something foreign, something unnatural. The power he wielded, once a wellspring of destruction, now felt like a cage closing around him. The bard clenched his jaw. He wasn't someone who believed in fate or prophecy. He wasn't someone who believed in warnings or signs. He had spent his life manipulating the world around him with his music, bending it to his will. And he wasn't about to let some mysterious stranger or whatever forces he was talking about take that away from him. With a sharp breath, the bard lifted his guitar once more, his fingers dancing across the strings in a practiced, fluid motion. The melody poured from him, strong and vibrant. The music filled the square, reverberating off the walls of the surrounding buildings, ringing through the air with a power that was undeniable. It was the same song he had played in every town, every village. It was the song of death, of decay, the melody that would turn life into ruin. His audience had always been so eager to listen, to be lulled into a false sense of peace before their very bodies betrayed them, collapsing into nothingness. But as the notes filled the air, he felt it again. That strange, unfamiliar feeling. The magic was still there, but it didn't feel right. It was as though the music, once his greatest weapon, was now a fragile thing, cracking at the edges. He paused, fingers still hovering over the strings. What was happening to him? Before he could play another note, a sound broke the silence, a whisper, soft but insistent. His head whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. The source of the sound was impossible to place. It wasn't the wind, nor the usual ambient noises of the night. It was something else. Something, living. And then, from the shadows at the edge of the square, emerged a figure. A woman, cloaked in tattered robes that hung loosely from her thin frame. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but her presence was undeniable, dark, ancient, like the very night itself had taken form. The bard's fingers twitched, the strings beneath his hand vibrating with a low hum of magic. He could feel the power in the woman's presence, a strange pull that tugged at his very soul. She was no ordinary person. "You shouldn't have played your music here," the woman said, her voice as cold as the grave, yet carrying an unsettling warmth beneath the surface. It was a voice that seemed to seep into his bones, making him shiver despite the heat of the night. "What are you?" the bard demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. The woman's words sent a cold ripple down his spine, and for the first time in a long time, the bard felt small. "I am nothing and everything," the woman replied cryptically. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as though every step was measured, every inch of her being infused with an ancient rhythm. "I am the echo of those you've claimed. I am the weight of the souls you've devoured, and I am the tide you've never seen coming." The bard raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening on his guitar. You think you can stop me? He scoffed. You think your empty words will have any effect on me? The woman's lips twisted into a smile that was both haunting and knowing. I don't need to stop you. I need you to feel what you've done. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and the world around them seemed to bend. The ground beneath the bard's feet seemed to shift, warping in unnatural ways. The village square blurred, as if time itself was distorting. He heard voices, soft, distant, sorrowful whispers rising from the very earth. He looked down, and to his horror, the bodies of his victims, those he had killed, those he had melted, were shifting. Their remains, once pools of liquid flesh, now seemed to move of their own accord. Their faces, still twisted in pain, began to take form again, rising from the muck like phantoms. The bard stepped back, his heart racing. His music, his magic had never done anything like this. He had never seen anything like this. The woman laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill through him. Do you see now, bard? Do you see what you've awakened? The ground beneath his feet trembled. The air grew colder, sharper. The spirits of his victims, dozens, hundreds, began to rise, their forms translucent, their eyes empty, filled only with anger and pain. They were not merely ghosts, they were something else, something darker. The woman's words were no longer a warning, they were a promise. You played with death, the woman whispered. And now, death will play with you. The bard stumbled back, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. He could hear the whispers of his past victims, feel their presence around him. The weight of the souls he had stolen now pressed in on him, heavier than any melody he had ever conjured. And, for the first time in his life, the bard truly understood that his power had come at a price. Chapter 6, The Price of Melody. The ground beneath the bard trembled again, as if the earth itself were groaning under the weight of the sins he had committed. The air was thick with the spectral presence of the dead, their faces now clear, their expressions contorted in a silent scream. Their forms hovered around him, swirling in a cold mist. For the first time in years, the bard felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: regret. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with horror, unable to look away from the ghosts of those he had destroyed. The music that had once been his ultimate weapon, his greatest joy, now seemed to hum with a cruel, twisted energy. The magic he had wielded for so long was now suffocating him, closing in from every direction. The woman stood in the center of the chaos, her dark cloak billowing as if caught by an unseen wind. She observed the bard with a kind of detached pity, as though watching a child make its final mistake. You've stolen life, she said, her voice soft but filled with a cold weight. And now, those you've taken from are coming to claim what's theirs. You thought you could control death, but death is not so easily manipulated. The bard's breath caught in his throat, and his fingers instinctively tightened around the neck of his guitar. The strings hummed beneath his fingertips, and for a brief moment, he considered summoning the power once more. His music, his deadly magic, could tear through these phantoms. It had to. But then, one of the spirits reached out, its bony fingers brushing the air just in front of him. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it sent a shock through him, a jolt of pure dread that froze him in place. No, he whispered, backing away again. His fingers twitched toward the guitar, but he found he couldn't summon the melody, couldn't force the music to his will. The air around him thickened, and he could feel the weight of all the lives he had stolen, all the towns he had destroyed, pressing in on him. The spirits, those he had melted, those he had robbed of their lives and their possessions, began to chant, their voices low and mournful. The sound was alien, inhuman, like the very earth was singing a dirge. Each word they spoke twisted his thoughts, disoriented him. You have taken from us. You have stolen. Now, it is time to pay. The bard's eyes darted to the woman, desperate, searching for some kind of way out. She stood unmovable, her gaze unwavering, as if she had known this moment was inevitable. "Why now?" he spat, his voice cracking. "Why do you come now? I've done this for years. I've killed hundreds, thousands, and nothing like this has ever happened before." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "You've always been able to control what you could see. But now, you've crossed into something you cannot control. There are forces older than your magic, older than your music. And they will not let you escape what you've done." He could feel it now, the deep, grinding pulse of something ancient, something terrible, beneath his feet. It was rising from the earth itself, from the very bones of the land. And it was coming for him. A sudden, sharp cry pierced the air, a voice among the chorus of the dead. The spirits began to coalesce, their forms growing clearer, more solid, their expressions full of anguish. But this one voice, this one cry, stood out above the rest. It was filled with hatred, with a burning rage that pierced the bard's soul. He looked toward the source of the cry, his heart sinking. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a woman, her face twisted in an expression of pure fury. Her clothes were torn, her body ravaged by the effects of his magic, but her eyes burned with an unrelenting fire. She had been one of the first to die, one of the very first victims to fall under the spell of his music. "You," she hissed, pointing a long, bony finger at him. "You destroyed my life, you melted me into nothing. You took everything from me, and now I come for you." The bard recoiled, his body stiffening as the woman's gaze bore down on him. The magic in his guitar surged again, but it was no use. The melody was gone, his power had fled from him, leaving him vulnerable. "You can't fight this," the woman continued, her voice growing more powerful with each word. "The dead are not yours to command. You've taken what was never yours to steal, and now you will pay the price." The bard's hands trembled. He had never feared death, never feared anything that would get in the way of his power. But now, as the spirits of those he had destroyed surrounded him, the full weight of his actions came crashing down on him. He had killed not for survival, not for some higher purpose, but for his own selfish enjoyment. And now, the dead had risen not for revenge, but for reclamation. "Please," the bard whispered, his voice barely audible. The words felt foreign in his mouth, a last attempt to grasp at something, anything, that might save him. But it was too late. The ground beneath him began to crack, splitting open as if the earth itself was swallowing him whole. The woman's smile widened. "There is no escape. You've awakened the wrong kind of spirit." The spirits closed in around him, their forms shifting and merging, becoming one, until all that was left was the terrifying, collective presence of those he had destroyed. The air was thick with their power, their rage, their sorrow. And in the midst of it all, the bard realized too late that he was no longer the master of the melody. The earth began to pulse with the rhythm of a song older than time itself. And the bard was the only one who didn't know the tune. Chapter 7, The Silence Between the Strings. The world fell silent. The pulsing, oppressive rhythm of the spirit's song disappeared into the void, leaving only the faint, distant hum of the earth's breath. The bard was surrounded, trapped in a place between life and death, between the music that had once given him power and the silence that now held him in its grip. He could feel his body trembling, but not from fear. No, this was different. It was as if the very energy of his being was being drained, sapped away by the multitude of souls that hovered around him. They didn't need to touch him. Their presence alone was enough to strip him of his strength, to undo everything he had built. He tried to breathe, but his chest felt heavy, as though each inhale was a weight pressing down on him. The air had thickened, turned viscous, like the very space around him was alive, suffocating him in its grasp. His fingers clenched around his guitar, the instrument still warm from the melody he had last played, but now it felt wrong, foreign. It was as if the strings themselves were resisting him, pulling away from his touch. The woman, The dark figure who had appeared from the shadows, was standing before him now, her form unwavering, her eyes alight with some quiet, knowing triumph. She said nothing, but there was no need. The atmosphere, the way the air hummed, spoke louder than any words could. For a moment, the bard's thoughts scattered, his mind running over the chaos that had ensued. He had always been in control, always. He had played his music to bend the world to his will, to make it follow his every command. But now, he was the one being controlled. The spirits surrounded him in a swirling dance, their forms no longer chaotic but methodical, as if they were conducting their own song, a song that resonated with something beyond his understanding. His fingers hovered once more over the strings of his guitar. The instinct to play to command the music was so strong, so deeply ingrained in him that it was like breathing. But no sound emerged. His heart raced. His mind spun in confusion, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The woman was right, there was no escape. He had played with forces he couldn't comprehend, and now those very forces were unraveling everything he had ever known. The music that had once made him a god, a destroyer of lives, was now silent. "I warned you," the woman said at last, her voice soft but undeniable. "The dead have a song of their own, bard. It's not a song you can learn to play. It's a song you must feel, and that is where you have failed." The bard's chest tightened. The way the woman spoke, it was as if she knew him better than he knew himself, as if she had seen the unraveling of his very soul long before he had. He had thought he was invincible, untouchable. But here, now, in the heart of this cursed place, he realized the truth. All the power he had wielded, all the lives he had taken, none of it mattered. In the end, it wasn't about how much destruction he could cause, how many notes he could play, how many people he could melt away. It was about balance. The spirits he had stolen, the lives he had shattered, there was always a price to pay. The woman's eyes glinted with a quiet sadness, something almost pitying. "You've taken so much from others, yet you've never asked yourself why. You've always sought power, sought control. But what you didn't understand is that control is fleeting, like the music you play. It's a sound that fades." The bard tried to speak, but his throat was dry, constricted, as though the very act of uttering a word would tear him apart. He couldn't bring himself to voice the questions clawing at his mind, questions about who this woman was, why she had come, why this was happening now. Her lips parted again, as though reading his thoughts. "I am not your enemy, bard. I am the consequence." At her words, the world seemed to shift. The ground cracked beneath him, and the air became colder still. A sensation like needles of ice pierced his chest. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the woman was no longer standing alone. Around her, the spirits began to take shape, their faces familiar now. They were the people he had killed, people he had once believed were nothing more than pawns in his twisted game. They were no longer ghostly echoes. Now, they were real, tangible. He could see the broken forms of the townspeople, their features twisted, the remnants of the lives he had stolen from them now fully realized in their spectral shapes. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, their faces full of grief, of anger, of sorrow. And then, all at once, they began to sing. It was not the hollow, mournful wail of the dead, nor the guttural cries of souls lost to time. No, this was a song of resurrection. A song of reclamation. The spirits' voices rose in harmony, their melody filling the space with an intensity that echoed in every fiber of the bard's being. It was not a song of death, it was a song of justice. The bard wanted to scream, to silence them, to play his own melody and drown out the sound of their voices. But his fingers could not move. The guitar, that instrument of death and destruction, remained still in his hands, its strings cold and silent. The magic that had once surged through it was gone, leaving him powerless, impotent before the spirits of those he had destroyed. The woman's voice was the last to join the chorus, her words ringing clear above the others. You cannot fight what you have become. You are nothing without your music, and your music is nothing without the souls you've taken. A wave of coldness swept through him, and the bard felt his body start to tremble. The spirits were closing in around him, their song rising in crescendo. His vision blurred again, and this time, he didn't fight it. The weight of his actions, the weight of every life he had stolen, was too much to bear. The melody he had created, the legacy of his destruction, was now his undoing. And in the midst of the rising song of the dead, the bard could feel his strength fade away, swallowed by the very silence between the strings. Chapter 8, The Last Note. The song of the dead grew louder, but to the bard, it was not a melody, it was a wall, a force, a tidal wave of sound and emotion that had no beginning or end. He could feel it reverberating through his bones, through his very soul. The harmony of the spirits was not just in their voices, but in their essence, in the way the song stitched the fabric of the world together. It was a song older than time itself, one he had never truly understood, never respected. He was drowning in it. The coldness in his chest spread, wrapping around his heart like an unyielding vice. The tremors in his hands began to subside, as if the very act of resisting was no longer possible. The guitar in his arms, his instrument of power, of destruction, felt heavier now, a weight he could no longer bear. His fingers, once so deft in manipulating the strings, now twitched uselessly. The instrument had become a shackle, binding him to the very fate he had tried so desperately to outrun. The spirits had encircled him completely, their eyes vacant, their faces still frozen in the terror and pain of their final moments. They no longer seemed like people, they were something more, something beyond human comprehension. They were the collective rage of the unjustly slain, the grief of the lost, the hunger of those who had been devoured by his music. He wanted to beg for forgiveness. But the words never came. How could they? What good would it do to speak now? What good was redemption when it had already been so thoroughly forsaken? His entire existence, the life he had crafted from death and destruction, had been a lie. And now, as the dead closed in, there was no escape. The woman, his silent observer, the one who had led him here, moved closer, her face no longer masked by the cold detachment she had once held. Now, her gaze softened, just a fraction, and for the first time, the bard saw something that almost resembled pity in her eyes. You see now, she said quietly, her voice blending with the voices of the dead. This is the cost of the song you played. This is what happens when you take life without understanding its true meaning. There is no control. There is no master of death, bard. Only the balance. The spirit's song reached its climax, their voices rising in a final, sweeping chord that filled the universe itself. The earth trembled once more, and the very air around the bard seemed to buckle under the pressure of their song. Every part of him ached, every fiber of his being screaming in agony. He had never experienced such a sensation before, the breaking of the self, the unraveling of everything he had ever known. His fingers, once poised to create destruction, now seemed incapable of movement. The guitar, once his greatest tool, the very source of his power, was now nothing more than a weight. A symbol of all he had lost. All he had taken. And then, in the heart of that soul-crushing silence, a single note broke through. It wasn't from the guitar. It wasn't from him at all. It was the note of the world, of the song that had been playing all along, the song of life, of balance. It was a note that resonated deeper than any melody he had ever played. It was pure. It was final. It was the last note. As it rang out, the spirits around him swirled, their forms breaking apart into strands of light, their voices fading into the ether. The chorus of the dead began to diminish, the sounds of their song becoming a whisper in the wind. And in that moment, the bard realized he had not played the final note. It had played him. The ground beneath him split open once again, this time not from the force of the spirit's song, but from the weight of his own destruction. He felt himself falling, descending into darkness, into the void that had always been there beneath his feet, waiting for him to acknowledge it. And as the light of the world above faded away, the bard's fingers finally released the guitar. It slipped from his grasp, the strings falling silent, the magic that had fueled it gone. The last note had been played, but it was not his to command. The end.